Ashcombe Hall had not employed a proper Duke's supper in 2 years, 4 months, and some odd days that nobody below stairs bothered any longer to count. And yet, on a particular Tuesday in October, a Duke sat at the servants' table eating cabbage stew from a stranger's own plate, because she had simply put it in front of him, and told him to stop looking so miserable about it. By the time the snow came that winter, the Duke of Ashcombe would have taken 41 suppers this way, in the same low-ceilinged kitchen, off the same chipped willow pattern bowl, before he worked up the nerve to ask the woman feeding him her own dinner what her name actually was. But first, the cabbage. Clementine Wren was 22, newly arrived from a village 3 counties distant, and entirely unencumbered by the information that would have ruined the whole enterprise, which was that the gaunt, ill-dressed man who kept wandering into the kitchen after midnight, looking like a debt collector who had lost an argument with a hedge, was in fact the owner of the house, the land, the hedge, and very nearly the county. She had been hired as an under-housemaid a fortnight prior, on the strength of a reference from an innkeeper who had known her father, and she had not yet been presented to His Grace in any formal capacity, on account of His Grace not receiving anyone in any formal capacity if he could possibly help it. She assumed the man in the kitchen was some manner of clerk, or perhaps a groom too proud to eat with the other grooms. She did not ask. She simply fed him, because that was the sort of thing her father had done for strangers his whole baking life, and grief had not yet managed to teach her otherwise. Gareth Vane, 7th Duke of Ashcombe, had not smiled in something over 2 years, a fact the household could state with the flat authority of men reporting rainfall totals, because they had been counting. He ate alone, when he ate, standing up, in rooms he did not sit down in, and he had sealed the west wing of his own house the week after his wife's funeral, and had not opened it since. Not the music room, not her garden. Not the sitting room where her work-basket still sat by the cold grate with a stocking half darned in it, because unfinished things, he had found, were easier to leave finished-looking than to look at. This is, however, a story about a woman who fed a strange man from her own plate, without knowing he owned the plate, the table, and the county the kitchen sat in, and about what that particular kind of not knowing did to a man who had spent 2 years being known only for his losses. Rewind, if you would, to the beginning, which is considerably more undignified than any of that, and involves a duke standing in his own kitchen at midnight because he could not sleep in a house with that many locked doors in it, and a new maid who had not yet learned which doors those were. Clementine had taken the position at Ashcombe Hall for the plainest of reasons, which was that her father had died the previous winter and left her a debt-free cottage, an empty oven, and no earthly notion of what to do with either. He had been the village baker for 30 years, a broad, unhurried man who fed travellers who could not pay exactly as generously as travellers who could, on the theory, stated so often it had become nearly a prayer, that bread withheld from a hungry stranger was bread wasted twice over. Clementine had absorbed this the way children absorb weather, without noticing she'd done it, and when the cottage and the oven proved insufficient company for a grief that large, she had gone looking for a house big enough to disappear into usefully. Ashcombe Hall, it turned out, had rather a lot of usefully to spare. She was assigned to the night rounds of the lower floor for her first month, on the reasoning that new girls made fewer mistakes when there was less staff about to witness them, which meant she was very often the only living soul awake in the kitchen past 11, keeping the fire banked and the larder locked, and on the nights her own appetite outpaced the servants' hall supper hour. eating her cold portion at the long scarred table by the light of a single candle. It was on one of these nights that the man appeared in the doorway, looking, in her private and immediate assessment, like a man who had been rained on by an argument. "You're not meant to be in here," she said, not unkindly, because it was true, and because someone ought to say it before Mrs. Pruitt did, with considerably less kindness. "I'm aware," he said. "Are you lost?" Extensively. She considered this answer, which struck her as either very stupid or very funny, and decided on the strength of his face that it was probably both. "Sit down, then, before you fall down. You look like a man who has been standing in a field arguing with a fence post." He sat, because it was easier than explaining that he had, in point of fact, been standing in his own hallway arguing with a locked door, which amounted to much the same thing and would have sounded considerably worse. She had one bowl of stew, her own, cabbage and barley and the heel of a loaf, and she did not so much offer to share it as simply push it a few inches in his direction, and hand him the second spoon she kept, out of an old and now orphaned habit, laid at every meal for whoever might turn up hungry, because her father had never once in 30 years sat down to a meal without setting a place for the door. "I couldn't," he said, in the tone of a man who very much could and rather wanted to. "You could," she said. "You're not going to get anything better at this hour unless you fancy raiding the pantry." And Mrs. Pruitt counts the cheese. She watched him take the spoon like a man handling something breakable. "You're new too, then, I haven't seen you about." "After a fashion," he said, which was not a lie exactly, in the way that a man who has recently rediscovered his own kitchen after 2 years of avoiding it might reasonably describe himself as new to it. "Well, I'm Clementine. Downstairs. 2nd month. And if you tell anyone I fed a stranger from my own bowl at midnight, I shall say you're mistaken, and that you ate a turnip you found on the floor." "Understood," he said, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that the corner of his mouth had moved. It did not complete the journey into a smile. The household would have logged the attempt and noted its failure with the solemnity of men measuring a flood line. But it moved, which was more than it had done in some time, and he covered the movement by studying the stew as though it required close professional attention. The dog arrived at this point, an elderly dignified hound named Plato, who had appointed himself some years prior to the position of household conscience, and discharged his duties by sitting, with great gravity, wherever judgment was most required. He sat now beside the stranger's chair, looked up at him with the frank appraisal of a magistrate reviewing evidence, and after a moment that felt to Clementine entirely too deliberate to be accidental, laid his head upon the man's knee. "He doesn't do that," Clementine said, with the wounded pride of a woman whose dog has publicly preferred a rival. "He's not done that to me in a fortnight of very good scraps." "Dogs have opinions," said the stranger, and did not elaborate. Because the opinion in question was that Plato had belonged to his wife, had grieved her nearly as visibly as he had, and had not voluntarily touched another human being in 2 years either. A fact the Duke found it difficult to discuss even inside his own head. He ate the stew. He ate rather more of it than he had eaten of anything in recent memory, and when it was gone, he sat for a moment looking at the empty bowl with an expression Clementine could not place, something between apology and astonishment, before he rose, thanked her with a formality that struck her as faintly comic, given the circumstances, and left the way he'd come, into the dark house, leaving her with a dog who had switched allegiances and a great deal of unasked curiosity. He told himself, walking back through his own darkened halls, that it had been an aberration born of hunger and a badly timed insomnia, and that he would not make a habit of eating a housemaid's supper like a stray. He did not examine this reasoning very closely, because reasoning examined closely tends to fall apart, and he had enough falling apart in his life already. He returned the following night regardless. The second visit, he told himself, was for the purpose of confirming the first had been a fluke. The third he attributed to a genuine concern about a draught in the corridor that happened to run past the kitchen. By the fifth, even he had stopped inventing reasons, though he had not stopped inventing excuses to voice aloud, which is a different and more useful thing entirely, since excuses can be said out loud without anyone examining whether they are also reasons. The east gate latch wants oiling, he informed her on the fifth night, apropos of absolutely nothing she had asked. "Does it?" said Clementine, already dividing her bread. "It does. I noticed it. Earlier you noticed a gate latch. I notice a great many things," he said, with the wounded dignity of a man aware that his cover story was, structurally, quite bad. "I'm sure you do," she said, and did not press it, because she had already decided, somewhere around the third night, that she did not particularly need a reason to feed a hungry man who kept turning up looking like a stray, latch or no latch, and that questioning good fortune too closely was how good fortune got embarrassed and left. By the second week, the gate latch had been joined by a roof that wanted looking at, a horse with a suspicious gait, and once, memorably, a concern about whether the well water tasted of iron, none of which he had any earthly business investigating personally at midnight, and all of which the household staff had begun to note with the quiet, delighted attention of people who have found the one piece of gossip worth having, and intend to ration it carefully. Mrs. Hobb the cook noticed first, because Mrs. Hobb noticed everything that concerned food, and the amount of stew disappearing from the evening pot had increased by a portion precisely correlated with a particular gentleman's visits. Mr. Ferris the butler noticed second, and confined his opinion, as he confined all opinions, to a single elevated eyebrow that Mrs. Pruitt the housekeeper had learned to read the way sailors read weather. Neither of them told Clementine anything, on the theory, unspoken but universally held below stairs, that a new maid who did not know she was feeding the Duke of Ashcombe his own cabbage stew from her own bowl was providing entertainment too rare and too fragile to risk with the truth. "She thinks he's a groom," Mrs. Hobb reported to Mr. Ferris on the sixth night, with the reverence of a woman relaying scripture. "She thinks he's a lost clerk," Mr. Ferris corrected, "and I intend to let her go on thinking it for as long as Providence allows. He ate 2 bowls Tuesday. He has not eaten 2 bowls of anything in this house in 2 years," said Mr. Ferris, and allowed himself, briefly, the eyebrow. What Clementine did not know, in those first weeks, was that the man she was feeding owned the roof he claimed to be worried about, the gate whose latch he claimed troubled him, and the horse whose gait he had never actually examined. What she did know was that he asked good questions, listened to her answers with a stillness she found oddly flattering, laughed at nothing yet but had. On the 9th night, made a sound very like the beginning of one before catching it and turning it into a cough, and that he ate like a man who had genuinely forgotten, somewhere along the way, that food could be a pleasure and not merely an obligation. She proved useful to him in ways he had not expected of a housemaid barely 2 months into her post. On the 11th night he mentioned, more to himself than to her, a dispute over a tenant's boundary hedge that the estate steward had been unable to resolve for a fortnight, the original grant having apparently gone missing sometime in the last century. And Clementine, without any great fuss, asked whether anyone had checked the parish tithe map rather than the estate's own copies, since parish records were kept independently and rarely lost track of a hedge even when everyone else had. The steward found the answer in the parish map 3 days later, exactly where she'd said it would be, and the tenant dispute dissolved into an embarrassed apology and a jar of preserves sent up to the house in gratitude. "How do you know a thing like that?" the Duke asked her that same week, with the particular caution of a man unused to being surprised by anyone below the rank of solicitor. "My father kept the parish accounts for the Bakers' Guild for 20 years, she said. "You learn where things are actually written down, as opposed to where people think they're written down. It's mostly the same skill as knowing which shelf the good preserves are on." He filed this away with the rest of the evidence he was accumulating, and not yet naming as evidence, and told himself, walking back through his own house afterward, that it was simply pleasant to have intelligent conversation at midnight. A claim that was entirely true and entirely insufficient as an explanation for the fact that he had begun, without noticing when precisely it happened, to look forward to the hour the whole day revolved around. By the 3rd week the pretext had grown so thin that even Clementine, who was not looking for gaps in his story, had begun to notice one. He arrived one night with no excuse offered at all, sat, ate, and when she asked, half teasing, whether the gate latch had finally been oiled to his satisfaction, he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would later, with the benefit of considerably more information, recognise as a man deciding whether to be honest, and said only, "The latch is fine. I wanted the stew." "Well," she said, recovering admirably, "that's a more honest reason than the last 4 you've given me, so I'll allow it." He almost smiled at that. The household would have logged it, 3 seconds, corner of the mouth, corrected within the count, filed under Tuesday. Clementine merely thought, privately, that he had a nice face when it forgot to be careful, and went back to her bread, unaware that she had just become the first thing in 2 years that a duke looked forward to more than he dreaded the rest of the day. Attention, her father used to say, was the first coin of love, and the only one that couldn't be counterfeited. She was paying it out freely, not knowing yet what she was buying, and he was spending everything he had left to earn it, not knowing yet what he owed. There is a particular geography to a grief that has been allowed to harden into architecture, and Ashcombe Hall wore its own like a map drawn in absences. The west wing had been shut since the funeral, its door locked with a key, Mr. Ferris kept but never used, and the corridor leading to it was dusted weekly by housemaids who had been instructed, without ever being told why, to dust up to the door and no further. The music room, which had once held a pianoforte the late Duchess Eleanor played every evening without fail, sat silent behind that door, its instrument under a sheet, its window curtains drawn against a light that no one had cause to let in any more. Her rose garden, which she had planted and pruned herself with the single-minded devotion some women reserve for children, had gone to a tangle of thorn and ambition, that the head gardener trimmed only enough to keep it from swallowing the path, on strict instruction never to plant anything new in it. Clementine learned the shape of this negative geography slowly, the way one learns the layout of a house by which doors creak, and always second-hand, because no one below stairs discussed the west wing directly, the way one does not discuss a wound in front of the person still bleeding from it. Mrs. Pruitt mentioned it first, obliquely, warning her off the corridor on her 2nd week, with a briskness that discouraged questions. Mrs. Hobb mentioned it a little more, over the shelling of peas, in the manner of a woman who had decided Clementine was trustworthy enough to be handed half a story. "It was 2 years this coming December, Mrs.," Hobbs said, not looking up from the peas. The Duchess had gone of a fever that took hold too fast for anyone to do a blessed thing about it, and His Grace, who had been away in London on estate business when it happened, had returned to find her already buried, which Mrs. Hobbs said was its own particular cruelty, arriving too late even to say goodbye properly, and had shut the door on the whole wing within the week and not opened it since. "He doesn't smile," Clementine said, not quite a question. 2 years, 3 months, said Mrs. Hobb, with the precision of a woman who had been keeping the figure the way some households keep the silver polished, out of respect rather than necessity, not once that any of us have seen. Mr. Ferris says he laughed at his own wedding breakfast so hard he had to sit down, if you can credit that of him now. Clementine could not entirely credit it, having only ever seen the aftermath, the careful, contained man who ate her stew at midnight and guarded his own face like a man guarding a house with too many windows already broken. But she filed the number away the way she filed away everything useful, and found, without quite deciding too, that she had begun keeping a private ledger of her own, tracking not the absence of his smile, but its occasional fugitive approach, the way one tracks weather that has not yet decided to break. She did not disclose her own grief to him easily, not because she guarded it as he guarded his, but because it did not occur to her that a duke's kitchen guest would want to hear about a village baker who had died of a winter chill the year before. Until one night, apropos of the bread on the table, she mentioned that her father had made a version of it, denser, with caraway, and that she had never gotten the proportions quite right since he'd gone, though she'd tried a dozen times. Tried and failed, or tried and simply not the same, he asked, with the specificity of a man who had learned the difference mattered. The second, she admitted. It's not bad bread, it's only not his bread. She looked at the loaf a moment. He used to say that grief was mostly just love with nowhere left to go, and that the trick wasn't to stop it going somewhere, only to send it somewhere useful. So I feed people. It's the only thing I know how to do with it that doesn't just sit in my chest being sad. He said nothing to this for a long moment, turning his spoon over once in his hand, and when he did speak, it was not about her father at all. I sealed a wing of my own house, he said, and told myself it was tidiness. Was it tidiness? No, he said. It was cowardice with excellent manners. He looked, briefly, as though he had surprised himself by saying it, and covered the surprise by eating, which she had begun to notice he did whenever a sentence had cost him more than he intended to spend. It became, over that month, a ritual neither of them named aloud, the way rituals of consequence rarely are named while they're forming. He came most nights, not all, and she began, without deciding to, setting aside a slightly larger portion on the nights she suspected he would, which was most of them, and if anyone below stairs had cared to keep a tally, and several of them did, with the devotion of racing men keeping odds, they would have noted that a duke who had not sat down to a proper meal in company for over 2 years had begun arranging his entire day around a midnight bowl of stew, shared with a housemaid who still called him nothing but sir, or occasionally. When she forgot herself, they fell into walking the kitchen garden path together some nights, after the bowl was empty, an activity that began as her showing him where the mint had gone wild and ended, by the 4th or 5th occasion, as simply a thing they did, unremarked upon, unscheduled, and entirely reliable, the way the moon is reliable. Neither of them declared it a habit. It became one regardless, the way water becomes a channel simply by being water long enough in the same low ground. "You've never asked my name," he said to her, on one of these walks, somewhere in the 3rd week of it, the frost just beginning to silver the mint leaves underfoot. "You've never offered it," she said. "I assumed you had your reasons." Everyone in this house seems to have reasons for things they won't say plainly, present company very much included. "I have reasons," he agreed, and did not offer the name even then, though he stood a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, looking at her in the thin moonlight with an expression the servants, had any been awake to witness it, would have logged immediately and at length. She noticed him looking. She did not look away, because looking away was not a thing she did, unafraid as she was of being seen looking back, and it was this, more than the stew, more than the questions, more than anything else in the whole slow accumulating month of it, that undid something in him that 2 years of grief had not quite managed to finish undoing on its own. The rain arrived properly in the 2nd week of November, the kind of rain that does not fall so much as commit, and it was this rain, more than any decision either of them made, that delivered the first honest conversation of the whole affair, because it trapped them both in the kitchen garden's small stone potting shed one evening with no dignified way out for the better part of an hour. Clementine had gone out to bring in the last of the season's herbs before the frost took them properly, and the Duke, who by then no longer pretended he came for gate latches or well water, had followed her out on the thin excuse of carrying the basket, a task she was entirely capable of managing herself, and which they both understood to be a fiction observed for form's sake. The rain came on so fast and so total that the 20 yards back to the house might as well have been a mile, and they took shelter instead in the potting shed, a low stone room smelling of clay and rosemary, with one guttering lamp and considerably less space than either of them had accounted for when they ducked inside it. "This is undignified," he observed, watching the rain through the single small window with the resignation of a man who had recently discovered that dignity, like everything else, was negotiable in a downpour. "This is Tuesday," said Clementine, settling onto an upturned crate with the ease of a woman who had made peace with undignified rooms some time ago. "You should see what dignity looks like on a Thursday." He almost smiled, and this time did not entirely correct it, which she noticed, filing it in the private ledger she still did not know she was keeping. They sat for a while in a silence that felt, for the first time since they'd met, entirely comfortable rather than merely companionable, and it was into this silence that she asked the question she had been carrying for 3 weeks, without quite admitting she was carrying it. "What happened to you," she said, "that you can't sleep in your own house?" He did not answer immediately, and when he did, the sentences arrived the way his sentences always arrived when the subject mattered, broken in the middle, restarted, abandoned partway, and picked back up from a different angle. "My wife," he said, "died 2 winters ago, of a fever, while I was away on business I did not need to be away for, and I have never quite forgiven the timing of it, or myself, and I locked the rooms that were hers, because I found I could not. That is, I discovered that an empty room with her things in it was somehow worse than a room with nothing of her in it at all, which makes no sense. And I know it makes no sense, and I have not found a way to make it make sense in 2 years of trying." "Her name," Clementine said, gently, "not a demand, an offer." "Eleanor," he said, and something in his shoulders eased very slightly at having said it aloud to someone who was not already carrying the weight of knowing her. Clementine was quiet a moment, turning a sprig of rosemary between her fingers. "My father," she said, "used to say the dead don't ask us to stop living, only to stop pretending we can live around a hole in the floor instead of over it." I lost him a year ago this winter, and I still can't make his bread taste right. And some days that feels like the whole grief all over again, over a loaf. But I'd rather have a badly made version of something he loved than no version at all. I think maybe that's the trick, not fixing the hole. Just building a floor over it that still remembers the hole is there. He looked at her for a long moment, in the low lamplight, with the rain still committing outside, and said, quietly, "I don't know how to do that." "No one does at first," she said. "You just start with something small. A bowl of stew, a gate latch that doesn't actually need oiling." She said this last with the ghost of a smile, letting him know she'd known, or at least suspected, for weeks, and he laughed. Not the full unpractised laugh the household was still waiting to log, but a short exhale of genuine surprise that was, none the less, the truest sound he had made in her hearing yet. It was in that shed, with the rain still committing outside, and the lamp guttering low, that she took the willow pattern bowl from the basket. She'd brought it out with her, from habit, still unwashed from the morning, and, finding nothing else to offer him against the damp and the cold, pressed it into his hands anyway, empty as it was. The way one presses something into a friend's hands, not because it is useful in the moment, but because the gesture itself is the point. "Keep that," she said. "It's only a bowl. But you looked as though you needed something to hold on to that wasn't a door frame." He held it a moment as though it were considerably heavier than a chipped kitchen bowl had any right to be, and something in his face, the household, had they seen it, would have called it the first real one, dated to the 2nd week of November, 3 seconds and a fraction. Filed and witnessed even in absentia by the rain itself, cracked open into something that was, unmistakably, unperformed, unpractised, and entirely his own. The obstacle, when it arrived by post, which the household had long ago learned, was where trouble in a house of this kind generally announced itself, since trouble too shy to knock in person nearly always found the courage to write a letter instead. It came in the form of 2 matters, arriving within the same week with the sort of timing that suggested the universe had decided one crisis was insufficiently dramatic and required a pair. The first was a visit, announced with exactly 1 day's warning, from the Dowager Duchess Honora, the Duke's own mother, a woman whose reputation below stairs had achieved something close to myth, on account of a tongue that could, in Mrs. Pruitt's memorable phrase, strip varnish at 40 paces. The second was a letter from a distant cousin, one Mr. Edmund Vane, heir presumptive to the dukedom in the entirely unlikely event Gareth failed to produce an heir of his own, raising, with a delicacy that fooled no one, the question of when his Grace intended to remarry, and enclosing, with even less delicacy, an introduction to a Miss Cassandra Pemberton, a gentlewoman of excellent family and, the letter noted twice, considerable fortune. "He means well, Mrs." Ferris observed of Mr. Edmund Vane, with the studied neutrality of a butler who did not, in fact, believe this for a moment. "He means the estate, Mrs." Pruitt corrected, which in men of his sort so rarely resembles meaning well that I've stopped troubling to tell the two apart. The Duke read the letter twice, standing in his study with the particular stillness of a man absorbing an unwelcome fact, and told no one, least of all Clementine, that he had spent the better part of the following night not sleeping over cabbage stew, but staring at a ceiling, wondering how he was meant to explain to a housemaid he had not yet properly courted that his family wished him married to. A stranger with a fortune, on a schedule that did not consult his preferences in the slightest. What he did instead, in the days before his mother's arrival, was quietly, and without any announcement, settle a debt Clementine did not know she was carrying, a small remaining sum owed on her late father's bakery lease, that the village landlord had been too polite to press, but not too polite to mention, in passing, to the estate steward, who mentioned it in turn to the Duke. Entirely by accident, and considerably to his own later regret at having done so with such thoroughness. The Duke paid it that week, anonymously, through the estate solicitor, with instructions that no name be attached, telling himself this was simple decency and nothing more. A claim that was, like most of his recent claims about his own motives, both true and wildly insufficient. The Dowager Duchess arrived on a Thursday in a carriage that announced itself a full quarter-mile before it reached the drive, and took approximately 11 minutes to identify, with the unerring instinct of mothers and generals, that something in her son's household had shifted since her last visit, though she could not immediately say what, only that he looked, for the first time in 2 years, like a man harbouring a secret rather than a wound, which she found, on reflection, considerably more promising. She sent for Clementine directly, bypassing Mrs. Pruitt's careful protocols entirely, on the pretext of requiring a second housemaid to help sort linens, and subjected her, over the course of that sorting, to an interrogation so thoroughly disguised as idle conversation that Clementine did not fully register she had been tested until it was nearly over. "You're new," the Dowager said, folding a pillow slip with the brisk economy of a woman who had folded 10,000 of them and resented none of the time. "Where from?" "3 counties east, your Grace. My father kept a bakery. Kept past tense. He died last winter. And you came here, to a house you'd never seen, to work for people you'd never met, rather than stay in a village where at least the grief was familiar." "Grief doesn't much care whether the room is familiar, your Grace. I thought I might as well grieve somewhere useful." The Dowager glanced up at that, sharp as a hawk marking a hedge. "Useful, not somewhere kind or somewhere safe. Useful, kindness is nice, ma'am, but it doesn't fold linens or oil a gate latch," said Clementine, and did not know, saying it, how precisely she had walked into the centre of the very thing the Dowager had come to investigate. The old woman set down her pillow-slip entirely. "My son has not eaten a meal in company in over 2 years, she said, "and yet Mrs. Hobb informs me, with an enthusiasm I found faintly suspicious, that he has taken his supper in this kitchen nearly every night for a month, at a table with a housemaid who apparently does not know who he is." Clementine went very still. "I don't understand, your Grace." "No," said the Dowager, not unkindly, "I don't imagine you do, which is rather the remarkable part of the whole business." She studied Clementine for a long moment, the way one studies a ledger for an error that turns out, on closer inspection, not to be an error at all, but the one correct figure in a page of mistakes. "Tell me plainly, girl, and I will know if you lie to me, because I have made a study of liars for 40 years, and you have none of their tells. Do you care for him for himself, or have you worked out by now precisely how much he's worth?" "I don't know how much he's worth," Clementine said, honestly bewildered. "I know he likes his bread torn, not cut, and that he goes quiet when a conversation gets near the west wing, and that he laughed properly, just the once, in the potting shed during the rain, and I know I've been feeding him from my own bowl for a month, because he looked like a man who'd forgotten food could be a kindness and not just fuel. I don't know what that's worth in pounds, your Grace. I only know what it's worth to watch it happen." The Dowager Duchess was quiet a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its varnish-stripping edge entirely, replaced by something considerably older and considerably more tired. My son laughed once at his own wedding breakfast so hard he had to be helped to a chair, she said. I had begun to believe I would never hear that sound again in my lifetime, and had made a kind of peace with it, the way one makes peace with a garden that will not bloom twice. She picked her pillow slip back up, folded it with hands that were not quite steady. You will forgive an old woman her caution. I buried a daughter-in-law I loved dearly, and I have watched my son bury himself alongside her for 2 years, and I did not intend to stand by while some clever girl mistook his loneliness for an opportunity. I never thought of it as an opportunity, Your Grace, Clementine said quietly. No, said the Dowager, I don't believe you did. That is rather the whole answer, isn't it? She reached over and, with a gesture that startled them both, pressed Clementine's hand briefly between her own. Feed him his stew, girl, and don't you dare stop on my account. I have been waiting 2 years for someone to feed that boy something other than sympathy, and I begin to think you're the first person clever enough to have done it without announcing the recipe. The second complication proved rather less easily resolved by conversation, since Mr. Edmund Vane's letter had, by the following week, escalated into a personal visit, delivered with the transparent urgency of a man who had heard, through channels he declined to specify, that his cousin's household had developed an irregularity below stairs that threatened to derail a marriage he had every financial interest in seeing arranged. He arrived at Ashcombe Hall with a solicitor in tow, and a face arranged into the particular expression of a man who believes himself to be acting entirely out of family concern, an expression Mr. Ferris privately classified as identical to the one worn by men who have recently discovered they are owed money. The Duke received him in the study, with a calm that Mr. Edmund Vane mistook, disastrously, for uncertainty. There is talk, Edmund said, settling into a chair he had not been offered, of an attachment forming below stairs. I mention it only because Miss Pemberton's family will want assurances, before any formal understanding proceeds, that His Grace's household is entirely settled. There is no formal understanding to proceed, the Duke said. I have not offered for Miss Pemberton, nor communicated any intention to. The estate's succession, however, remains a matter of some urgency, given the absence of an heir, and I should think, you should think, the Duke said, with a mildness that Mr. Ferris, listening at a discretion that fooled no one, would later describe to Mrs. Pruitt as considerably more alarming than shouting would have been, about the coal rights you have been quietly attempting to lease out of the estate's eastern boundary for the past 18 months. Under an authority you do not, in fact, possess, since the deed of entail you have been citing to 3 separate mining concerns was revoked by my grandfather in a codicil my solicitor discovered last spring, and has been sitting on, at my instruction, until it proved useful. Mr. Edmund Vane's face underwent a series of adjustments that Mr. Ferris later described, with some relish, as resembling a man watching his own carriage roll downhill without him in it. I have the documents here, the Duke continued, sliding a folder across the desk with the unhurried precision of a man who had prepared this exact moment for several days. Should you wish to review them before your solicitor does, or before I have occasion to mention the matter to the mining concerns directly, who I understand have already paid you a deposit against a lease you had no legal standing to grant. Nothing further was said that could be called a confrontation. Mr. Edmund Vane took the folder, went considerably pale, and departed within the hour, citing a prior engagement that everyone in the room understood to be entirely fictional, and no one in the household ever learned precisely what arrangement he made with his solicitor afterward, to extract himself from the Cole concern's understandable displeasure, only that he was not invited back to Ashcombe Hall, and did not attempt to invite himself, and that no one noticed him leave, which he would have minded most of all. The rumour of Miss Pemberton, deprived of its engine, dissolved within the fortnight into the sort of thing society forgets by the following season, and the Duke, walking out to the kitchen garden that night, with a lightness in his step the household had not observed in 2 years, found Clementine exactly where she always was, and told her, for the first time, plainly and without pretext, precisely who he was, and precisely how long he had known she didn't know, and precisely how afraid he had been that the knowing would change the way she looked at him. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished, turning this new and enormous fact over the way she turns over unfamiliar coins, checking their weight against what she already knew of him. "You're the Duke of Ashcombe," she said finally. "I am. You've been eating my dinner for a month. I have. You let me hand you a chipped bowl like it was the crown jewels." "It rather was," he said, "under the circumstances," and she laughed, the sound startling itself out of her before she could arrange her face around it, because that, more than the title, more than the house, more than anything else he might have told her, was the thing that convinced her nothing important had actually changed at all. The obstacle cleared. The Duke found himself facing a considerably more frightening prospect than a scheming cousin or an unimpressed mother, which was the plain necessity of telling a woman who had fed him from her own plate for a month that he intended to do considerably more than eat her cooking for the rest of his life, and finding, to his own private mortification, that 2 years of silence had left him almost entirely without the vocabulary for saying so. He rode out to the tenant farms early that week on business that could easily have waited, and came back later than expected in a cold rain that had soaked entirely through his coat. Hair plastered flat, boots ruined, and an expression on his face that Mr. Ferris, opening the door to him, privately catalogued as the look of a man who had ridden considerably farther than any errand strictly required, in order to arrive at a decision rather than a destination. "Is she in the kitchen?" the Duke asked, before his coat was fully off. "She is, Your Grace, and if I might observe, you are dripping on a floor she scrubbed only this morning." "Noted," said the Duke, and went anyway. Clementine looked up from the table, where she had been shelling the last of the season's peas by lamplight, and took in the state of him, soaked through, hair not remotely in order, an expression on his face somewhere between terror and resolve, with the particular alarm of a woman who has learned to read weather in a man's posture. "You'll catch your death," she said, rising, probably. He agreed, and did not sit down, which she noted, because in 2 months he had never once failed to sit down immediately upon arrival, and something about him standing there, dripping, clearly working up to something, silenced whatever else she'd meant to say. "I have a list," he said. "A list of reasons. I wrote them down, on the ride back, because I did not trust myself to say them properly without one, and then I lost the paper somewhere around the second gate, so I am afraid you will have to accept them from memory, which will be considerably less organised." "I can manage disorganised," she said, setting down the peas, "because you moved the beehives without asking anyone, and improved the honey by a measurable amount within the season, which the estate steward still cannot entirely explain," he said. "Because Plato has not slept anywhere but at your feet in 6 weeks, and Plato does not extend that particular courtesy lightly. Because the library, which I have not properly used in 2 years, has become unbearable to sit in on the evenings you're occupied elsewhere in the house, for reasons I did not examine closely until it was too late to pretend otherwise. Because you fed a stranger from your own bowl without once asking what it would cost you to do so, which is, I have come to believe, the rarest form of kindness there is. Rarer even than the kind people perform in front of witnesses. Because I stopped being able to imagine the rest of my life as a thing that happened to me alone in a locked house, somewhere around the 9th bowl of stew, and did not notice I'd stopped until considerably later, and because, he stopped here, the sentence folding in on itself the way his sentences always folded when the ground beneath them mattered too much to trust to eloquence. Because I am doing this very badly, and I know I am doing it badly, and I find I would still rather do it badly tonight than do it perfectly at some later date when I've had time to compose something worthy of you. Because I am not certain there is time enough in a lifetime to compose something worthy of you, and I would rather begin badly now than wait for a perfection that isn't coming. Is there an actual question anywhere in that? Clementine asked, though her voice had gone considerably less steady than the words suggested. Marry me, he said. I am aware I have made a very poor showing of the asking. You are doing it exactly right, she said. Badly is how anything true gets said the first time. Yes, obviously, yes, and here, at last. 2 months and 1 chipped bowl and 41 shared suppers in the making. The laugh arrived, the real one. The one the household had been waiting 2 years, 3 months, and an uncounted number of days to hear, and it did not arrive small or careful or quickly swallowed. It came up out of him whole, startled and unguarded and entirely his own, and it went on. By the counting of the only witness present, besides Clementine herself, who happened to be an elderly hound now thoroughly reformed in his loyalties, for the better part of 11 full seconds, which she would later inform Mrs. Hobb was, by some margin, the longest sound of pure joy she had ever personally been responsible for producing in another human being, and she intended to keep the number. The wedding, when it came, was a smaller and considerably more comic affair than the county had anticipated, held in the estate chapel on a bright morning in the following spring, attended by a household that had, by unanimous and largely unspoken agreement, appointed itself the true architect of the whole romance, and intended to take credit for it at every future opportunity. The Dowager Duchess wept through the entire ceremony with a thoroughness she would later deny with some heat. Mrs. Hobb produced a wedding breakfast so ambitious that Mr. Ferris was obliged to intervene twice regarding the seating of an unauthorized third pudding. Plato, despite explicit and repeated instruction to remain in the kitchen for the duration of the vows, arrived at the chapel door precisely as the register was being signed, deposited himself directly across the bride's feet with the satisfaction of a dog collecting on a long-standing wager, and could not, by any means short of actual violence, be persuaded to leave before the wedding breakfast concluded. And the beehives come with me to the West Garden, Clementine informed her new husband, over the signing of the register, with the particular briskness of a woman who intended her marriage vows to include several unspoken riders. That is not negotiable. Nothing about you has been negotiable since October, the Duke said, and I have made my peace with it, and kissed her briefly, in front of a household that had been waiting for precisely this occurrence, with the patience of people who had, in point of fact, engineered a considerable portion of it themselves. Spring came properly to Ashcombe Hall, the way it comes to a house that has finally decided to let it in, which is to say all at once and with considerable enthusiasm, as though the season itself had been waiting at the gate for permission. The west wing, sealed for 2 years against a grief its owner had not known how to walk past, was opened the week after the wedding, not all at once, and not without a morning the new Duchess spent quietly beside her husband while he sat with his hand flat against a work-basket that still held a half-finished stocking, saying nothing for the better part of an hour, before he picked up the needle himself, clumsily, and finished the last 6 rows exactly wrong, and left it that way on the shelf on purpose, a monument to effort rather than perfection, which struck them both as considerably more honest than any finished thing could have been. The music room's curtains were drawn back the same week, and though no one in the household could play the pianoforte with anything resembling skill, Clementine took to picking out, badly and with great cheer, the 2 tunes her own mother had taught her as a girl, and the Duke found, to his considerable surprise, that he did not mind the wrong notes nearly so much as he had once minded the silence, and would sit in the doorway most evenings listening to her murder a country air, with real affection for the noise of it. The rose garden, given over to a season of ambitious tangle, was cut back not to nothing but to itself, its original bones rediscovered under 2 years of thorn, and new roses were planted alongside the old ones rather than in place of them. At Clementine's specific and gently insisted upon instruction, because the dead, she had told him once in a potting shed during a rainstorm, are not meant to be replaced, only allowed to keep their half of the garden while the living plant the other half beside them. By that first summer the smile deficit ledger the household had kept for over 2 years, without ever discussing it aloud, had been retired entirely, replaced by a different sort of accounting Mrs. Hobb undertook with evident satisfaction. The Duke smiled most mornings now, generally over breakfast, occasionally before it, and had laughed at least once in most weeks since the wedding, a rate of occurrence that would have seemed, 18 months prior, as improbable as snow in June. Plato divided his loyalties evenly between the couple, and in his elder years took to sleeping across both their feet at once whenever the fire was lit. A diplomatic solution he appeared to consider entirely his own idea. The Dowager Duchess visited twice a season thereafter, folded no more linens on any pretext whatsoever, and referred to Clementine, within a year, exclusively as my daughter, a title she deployed with the same varnish-stripping authority she brought to everything else, daring anyone present to question it. Mr. Edmund Vane, it was reported some months later through channels the household declined to specify, had settled his coal difficulties by means of a modest inheritance from an aunt no one had previously known he possessed, and had removed to a smaller property 2 counties distant, where he was said to be attempting, with limited early success, an interest in sheep. The willow pattern bowl, chipped nearly to uselessness by 2 years of hard kitchen service before that October, and rather more since, was not retired to some ceremonial shelf as sentiment might have demanded, but kept in ordinary rotation in the kitchen, exactly where it had always lived, on the theory, stated plainly by the new Duchess to anyone who asked, that a thing which had done its whole quiet work by simply being used had no business being turned into a relic the moment it succeeded. It was Mrs. Hobb who eventually mended the worst of its cracks with a careful application of glue and patience, and who noted, setting it back on its shelf, that it looked rather better mended than it had looked whole, which she considered, on reflection, to be true of 1 or 2 other things in that particular house as well. There are stories that begin with a woman handing a stranger a bowl of soup, because she does not know any better than to be kind to whoever is hungry in front of her, not knowing that the stranger owns the house, the table, and very nearly the county the table sits in. This one began that way, in a cold kitchen in October, over cabbage and barley and a gate latch that never once needed oiling, and it ended, as these things properly should, with a man who had forgotten how to smile learning the shape of it again, from a woman who had never once performed hers, in a house with every door finally standing open, and a dog asleep across both their feet, keeping, as he always had, the only score that ever really mattered.